Good morning, welcome. Thanks for joining this third event for the NHS Futures Compass events. I am Sally McIntosh. I am your host for this event. For those of you who don't know me, which is probably most of you, I work within National Services Scotland. The Scottish NHS is broken up into various health boards. We are made up of territorial health boards and special health boards. NSS is a special health board, and we provide national services across Scotland. One of those services that we provide is project and programme management services. So we have about 200 project professionals who are delivering change across the Scottish health sector. So this conference is of great interest to us. So I'm delighted that we're here today. So just before I hand you over to Kate and Paul, I've got some information on the setup. So as you'll see on the right of your screen, there is a panel with chat and Q&A. It would be great if you think of questions through the session to post them in the Q&A. And if someone has already posted a question that you also would like answered, then if you can uptick that, that's really helpful, because then at the end of the session, we will make sure that we answer the most popular questions. There is also a chat button, and that is so you can chat. For those of you who joined early, there was the game code at the start, and there will be a game code at the end for those of you who are here through to the end. So without further ado, we'll move on to the presentation. So I would like to introduce Kate Nowitzki and Paul Dowse. Paul is the Head of Digital Data Technology Project and Analysis at Acas. Prior to joining Acas 3 years ago, Paul spent the majority of his career at Land Registry, delivering IT-enabled transformational change. Kate is a Director of Strategic Planning, Performance and Change at Acas. And fortunately, she and Paul are working together to champion and implement practical change management approaches. So I am personally very excited to hear what they have to say about the lessons they have learned, both at the Land Registry and Acas, and how they have been implementing change management. So over to Paul and Kate. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Sally. We're actually going to start with a bit of a poll question to find out where you guys are in terms of frameworks around change management and project management, which kind of is the start of the story that I'll tell going back to my Land Registry experience before handing over to Kate to pick up the story of where we started to work together at Acas and how we've taken some of these learnings forward. So if we could start with the first poll on screen, that would be great. There we go. Cool. So it looks like, I know it's early, I'm not sure how long that's going to take for everybody to have a chance to vote, but it looks like from the bar there that most of your organizations do have some kind of project management framework and established processes, but slightly less on the change management side, potentially. Just a lot of yeses there. Okay, so that's the first question. Shall we go on to the second question? See if I shoot myself in the foot now and see lots of yeses on this one as well. A little more even. Oh, there you go. So about 50-50 there. So as a big generalization, maybe it does look like most of your organizations have some kind of project management framework and kind of processes, but less so on the change management side. So going back to where I was kind of 2014, 15, I'd say that was very much the same kind of perspective that we were in. So just to give some of that context. So going back in that time, when I worked at the Land Registry as Head of Strategic Developments, we did have a huge organisational change agenda. The word transformation, which is banding around all the time these days, was definitely front and centre of the exec's mind, and certainly the board. We just developed a new business strategy. We'd had a new CEO appointed to deliver that strategy. And there was lots of political pressure. And I'm sure that resonates with you guys in the NHS, because we felt like a political football at times with privatisation and those kind of agendas. But the NHS is probably the biggest political football there is, with every government coming along with strong views about the rights and wrongs of how to manage the health service. So hopefully there's some kind of parallels there. In terms of our capability to deliver some of that change, I'd like to think particularly as I was responsible for the project and program centre at the time, but we did have a kind of solid basis to launch from. We had established processes. We'd done lots of internal driven IT change. In particular, we had a big IT department. Senior managers and lots of project managers were trained in things like Prince2, Agile, RUP, DSDM. So from a methodology point of view, particularly, as I say, on the software development side, it was well established and kind of long-standing. And unlike some and many government departments, Land Registry is self-funding, which was quite a key point, really, because that meant that although we weren't awash with money, we could raise our own money and spend our own money within reasonable constraints, which meant we had a bit more flexibility about who we could partner with, how we could make some of those decisions. Not that it was a free-for-all by any stretch of the imagination. So that was the kind of project management perspective. But thinking back, when I started to put these slides together, from a change management perspective, it really struck me. And one of the lessons I think I've learned is how long the corporate memory can be around change. So one of the things that really scarred, for want of a better word, I say on the slide had a traumatic effect, was the financial crisis of 2008. So that was a tough time. And we closed lots of offices. We made lots of people redundant. Lots of people had to relocate if they wanted to keep their job. And we didn't recruit anybody for a long time. So if you remember at the time, the house market basically crashed overnight. People stopped remortgaging. All of that work used to come through Land Registry's front door, and it just literally fell off the edge of a cliff. And as I said, privatisation had been on the agenda as well. A bit later than 2008, but closer to 2014. And so all of this was reflecting in the organisation's view from the staff, certainly, as to how well Land Registry was at managing change. Now, if I go back to how we tackled the 2008 crisis, from a project management perspective, we implemented an accelerated transformation plan transformation program to keep in with the jargon of the day. And it was really successful. We were under budget, benefits in cash terms were above projections, lots of changes were very well implemented. But from the staff's perspective, as you can see in those figures, whilst across the civil service, leading and managing change was deemed to be a 43% staff survey result. And I believe I've seen some results, I think within the health service, you're on a very similar, if not identical survey. From a Land Registry perspective at the time, it was 19%. And the individual question around how well it's managed was down at 12%. So at times it felt a little bit like if we wanted to change something, the unions and some of the staff were going to react a little bit like the Hulk, that every time the word change of a significant scale came along, people were thinking back to 2008 and getting really angry that they were going to be made redundant, or maybe scared rather than angry as well. So how did we tackle that change? I think to some extent, we did go back to our comfort zone. What I'm showing on the slide there, and don't worry, I'm not going to talk through that process, but under the chairmanship of the newly appointed CEO, and I think that's a really important point, again, a classic project management lesson about getting buy-in from the top. We established a transformation board. We had lots of things within the new business strategy that required projects to be delivered to reap the benefits that we were looking for and the changes. And I led a team jointly supported by PwC, where we developed a comprehensive end-to-end project and program process. This is a snapshot of which is on the screen there. And it was underpinned for some quite complex tools, which allowed us to make some great decisions around how to prioritize, how to schedule, what resources were available, what benefits we were going to manage and track, and all the typical RAIDs, kind of risk and issue stuff that project managers are familiar with. So from that perspective, it was working really well. As I said, we had that exec support. The transformation board was represented by every director plus a few special guests. And it did give us clarity on all of those classic things. But as I say at the bottom of the slide, from a change management perspective, it perhaps wasn't so good. It was the old question of, so what's in it for me? And I can remember quite vividly around the board table, we used to have these conversations about, but what about the impact on people? What would Mary in Nottingham say, who became a kind of proxy for change management conversations? So we did some of the classic stuff, for want of a better phrase, where we iterated the transformation board report so it had more information about change. We tried to get quite granular in terms of the functions and the changes that were hitting them. But again, those big projects are only half the picture. And as well as the big things that get all of the headlines, there's lots and lots of changes that are happening all around the organization, all of which are hitting people, but aren't really in that big scale that's looked at from that transformation board perspective. So we tried to remedy that by creating a single view of change, but most importantly, jointly sponsored between myself and the HR director at the time, we developed a people change framework. And that's what I'm going to center on now, just talking about the highlights of that people change framework and how that had an impact. So it really was trying to just provide a tool that was quite basic deliberately. It was nowhere near as sophisticated as some of the stuff I was just talking about around the project management changes and processes and tools that we implemented. And that was because we wanted to provide something that anybody could use, not somebody that was necessarily steeped in project or change management. So it was designed to be used for all changes, be it a local office changing around one team, all the way through to tying in with some of the big change that I talked about. I'll come back to the point about it being aligned to the overarching project process and how we did that. And it was basically made up of 4 stages: make it essential, make it ready, make it happen, and make it stick. And I'll very quickly talk through some of those stages and some of the tools that we used just by way of demonstration. So really the first part is just making sure that you've got a sound rationale for why you want to make this change and understand where you are at the moment. So it was really about asking who's going to be affected, what's the impact of this change going to have on them, how can we involve people in the change, how does it align to all of our other business strategies and plans to make sure it's the right thing to be doing from that perspective. And we provided some simple tools, some of which kind of repeat all the way through. So one of them, as an example, I'm sure you're familiar with this, talking to a lot of project professionals on this call, no doubt, that I'm sure you're not hearing anything you didn't already know. But so we used the old Rudyard Kipling poem, basically constantly asking questions through the process to help people figure out what's the change they want to make, why do they want to make it, when is it going to be made, how are they going to do it, where's it going to happen, who's it going to impact, those kind of questions. And that as a methodology almost would repeat through the process. So if we were talking about communications, for example, what do we want to communicate, why do we want to communicate it, when are we going to do it, how are we going to do it, which channel, is it face-to-face, in which locations, and who's going to be the recipient as well as the deliverer of those messages. We came up with little things, and I'm sure, again, you'll have seen very similar problem statements. Credit to Kate, who can pick up the story here. When I came to Acas and we started to think about similar kind of issues there, Kate, being ever the optimist, didn't like the problem statement, so we turned it into an issue and opportunity. But basically, again, just the issue of, in this example, T&S processes not meeting user needs affects everybody, the impact of which is a waste of time, and a good solution would provide an opportunity to make claiming quicker and easier and cheaper. So it's just some little tools to help frame the problem statement or the opportunity. And then at the end of that, there were some basic checklists peppered through the framework that would help people just kind of sense check where they were and have they got the information they need, and are they confident to move on. And tying back to how that worked at a higher level, what we started to do as we got more mature through this process is we tied it right back into the overarching process. You can see the arrow that's appeared, which wasn't on the previous slide, where we've taken the end of the make it ready stage, and where appropriate, that factored right into the assessments that would be more traditional gateway review type assessments through each of the projects and programs as appropriate. So very quickly to run through some of the other stages. So the next stage is making it ready, making sure now that we've understood those impacts on people and any other impacts that we need to think of. So, for example, these days, GDPR or a fraud impact assessment might be considered at that point as well. Starting to turn our attention in a bit more detail to the benefits, making sure we know how they'll be measured and whether there's a baseline and how that's going to play through. Then start to develop a simple task plan. So for most local changes here, we weren't talking about big 10,000 line project plans. This was literally a little task list. You might use Planner or something similar these days. Making sure that we're talking to our stakeholders and planning the comms, and that we've got some tools and guidance available for people to use. Then we moved on to making it happen, which is effectively running the change, making sure that that communication's constantly in place, those stakeholders are being communicated with and listened to, and most importantly, that we're refining our plans and taking that feedback into account. Where things were starting to change and be implemented, that we're looking at those benefits and making sure that we're managing any risks, etc., that have come up. So it sounds slightly more project management-y, but it's very much coming from the angle of people. It's very much about the people on the ground. How are they feeling about this change? How's it impacting them? What feedback are we getting? And then finally, the traditionally hard part, making that change stick. So this is all about embedding the change, making sure the outcomes were coming through that we were expecting and that people were actually adopting the change and it's becoming business as usual. And there were some methods and techniques developed by the team in terms of how to do that by conducting reviews, interviewing stakeholders, etc. Nothing revolutionary, but just some good practice that enabled people to manage this through. So how was it all working? So if we go back to those figures at the left-hand side, 2014, you can see the three charts there, the three lines for where we were against the civil service down at 19 and 12%. And by the time towards halfway through 2017, when I left to join Acas, you could see that the numbers had risen quite significantly. We'd really closed that gap. Thinking about it, from a kind of classic change management perspective, I think what we've done here is just taken the classic change curve and mapped it in terms of where our effort was being placed prior to the change framework, but against its stages. And hopefully this might resonate with a lot of people, that the change management side traditionally seemed to take an awful lot of effort in that make it stick phase. And that was where all the hard work used to take place. But what we noticed through implementing the change framework is that we dragged a lot of that hard work and thinking forward. Sounds obvious with hindsight. And by the time we were actually making it happen, people had gone through some of those more difficult denial and anger phases and were more accepting before the change had actually gone live. Just to come towards the end, pleased to say, despite since I've moved on, the Land Registry has continued to develop this, and they've made some more changes since 2018, particularly in terms of professionalisation. I mentioned right at the beginning that we had quite a lot of people qualified in project management, programme management, those kind of disciplines, but not so much on the change management. And they've invested quite heavily in that and also revamped the change framework itself. So it looks slightly different these days, but it's continued to have a great effect. And if you look at that slide now, adding from 2019 through to current day, the numbers have continued to rise sharply, which is fantastic to see. So I'm going to stop there. You'll probably be pleased to hear. And I'm going to hand over to Kate, who's going to start with another poll question.
I am, Paul. Thank you. If we could go straight to the poll before I do anything further. This is always the moment of jeopardy, of course, isn't it? Because when you ask a poll question, you do it in the hope that you'll get the answer that you're expecting to get. So let's see how we do here. So we've got this first question here is, do you have a project management qualification or equivalent? Wow, there's a big resounding lot of yeses on that, aren't there? So now I know my audience, that's for sure. And can we put up the second question as well, please? Thank you. Do you have a change management qualification or equivalent? Oh, wow, yeah. I was slightly alarmed for a moment there. It took a minute to change. Yeah, oh, that's really handy to know. It's about half, or just under half. Well, that's really fantastic, and that really frames up the second half of our input this morning. Thank you. Really good to see that, and I'll explain how it fits in. A few opening words for myself, really, about how Paul came then to leave Land Registry and come over to Acas. So there was I, newly appointed as the Transformation Director a year after Acas had started undergoing a programme of transformational change, actually, and the previous Transformation Director had moved on from the role, and I stepped into that. And I was, quite honestly, I was bewildered of Acas. I was really excited and committed to doing a good job in a difficult situation, but I wasn't sure which way to turn. And a colleague said to me, she said, "Oh, I used to work in Land Registry, and there's a chap there, Paul Dowse. You should have a word with him." Well, I was on that phone before you could say transformation, and several phone calls, and then several meetings later, I had somehow or another twisted Paul's arm to come and spend some time with Acas. And his notion of a bit of time, I don't know, but here we are 3 and a bit years later, and that's been fantastic, because at that time, as Paul's explained so clearly, Land Registry was an organisation that got some resources that they put into this. They focused on it. Project management was clearly part of Paul's responsibilities there, a lot of expertise and skill in that area. Acas, by contrast, a much smaller organisation, only 1,000 employees. And whilst we've done a lot of change over the years, actually, as an organisation, absolutely we're lacking in project management capacity and capability. And also we'd got a lot of positive intent around change management, but we were coming up against a few issues, which I'll clarify in a moment. So as I've got in my notes here, sometimes it felt to me that Paul and I were like pioneers on a dangerous frontier, quite honestly. But we started to move things along. And what you can see here is a sort of Acasified, which is a new verb, which I'm introducing specially for today, version of the Land Registry change management framework. So that was one of the things that we started to get to grips with. And we're doing that against the context of an organisation. If you reflect on, Acas is the employment relations specialists. So an awful lot of people in Acas know their rights. So when it comes to making changes, we're doing that in that environment, in a highly unionised environment, with union membership in excess of 80%, in fact, pushing 90%. And the sorts of changes at that time that we were engaged in as an organisation, they involved relocating a particular team that we got, which was diversely distributed in 12 centres down to 4. That's a significant change. We were making very significant changes to the grading and ways of working across one of our key services. It affected the majority of our staff. And we were closing an office as well, which is always an emotional and difficult time. So it was in that context that Paul and I stepped out, and I was so pleased to have been able to have hauled him over the bridge out of Land Registry and into Acas. So next slide, please, Paul. I like it when I say next slide, please, because it's a bit like the Chris Whitty thing on the telly, isn't it, with the COVID? Enough of that. So it was Paul's voice of encouragement and wisdom and help over the years, which has been personally instrumental in my growth and understanding and knowledge around change management. And it's also been instrumental in bringing significant changes into Acas, for which myself and others are hugely grateful. And if we reflect on that poll question, where everybody in this audience is project management qualified or program management qualified one way or another, against sort of just under half change management qualified. And I think about that and think, oh, that's the journey, that's the part of the journey on the change management side that we're still on, but I think we've made some really significant steps forward with. So we took that change management framework and we Acasified it, we made it our own. And we did all sorts of other things, and which I'm going to illustrate through the example you see on the slides here and talk you through today. But before I do that, I just want to reflect on 3 things which I think Paul, myself, and others involved in this agenda do and have done and continue to do, which I think make a difference and are perhaps worth reflecting on for yourselves and your own organisations. One of them is we hold out and shine a light on the narrative around change management. It's an explicit conversation in Acas now, which it didn't used to be 4 years ago when we were in the midst of that transformational change. We knew we were in the midst of change, but now we talk explicitly about wanting to improve how we manage change. And we don't shy away from that. And Paul and I look for opportunities to keep that narrative up front and centre whenever we can. We, together, as we've already seen with that framework, have developed resources. We established a change management office, the CMO, not the PMO, the CMO, which incorporates the PMO. So there we were undergoing significant transformational change 4 to 5 years ago, and we didn't have a PMO in the organisation. We had precious few project managers, and the very few that we had were very firmly embedded in, indeed some might argue well hidden in, the digital and technology part of the organisation. Okay, they were very niche for us at that time. So we put in new resources, we put in the framework, we put in the change management office, and the good people who work in there now have expanded those resources, and we've got resources available for colleagues through SharePoint, through Yammer, we've got change project principles, etc. And the other thing we've done, and Paul and I champion really, is the growing of the capability of colleagues, both in project management and in change management. And we're now really pushing that agenda through strongly through our change management training for line managers, through APMG accreditation for a few of us, myself and a few others have got APMG accreditation. So we're really putting our money where our mouth is on that agenda. And change management, in some ways, it's not complex, but it can be complicated, and you need to really put some energy and focus in it, as Paul has made so clear and is illustrated beautifully. And if you put the focus in and put the effort in, you can get the results there, which I think is an absolutely brilliant thing to see on the Land Registry People Survey results. But it does take effort, and that's what I'm going to draw a bit of attention to in this example. So this is relatively recent. It's not part of the previous transformation programme, but what you can see here are 2 buildings. I'm really hoping that you can recognise the one on the left. Okay, so there we have 10 Downing Street, and on the right you have Euston Tower, which was the Acas head office, if you like, our flagship office. It's where our corporate services were housed, as well as our London-based delivery colleagues. Okay. And in 2020, the lease was due to end. So a good 18 months beforehand, we were looking at getting that change underway, as it were. And so that's kind of straightforward, isn't it? Getting an office move. But on the left here, the reason we've got the Downing Street picture there is because of Places for Growth, which is a government initiative to grow the civil service in the regions, and that introduced a degree of complexity. Next slide, please. Thank you. And thus it brought challenges for us. So what should have been a transactional, straightforward change, as straightforward as an office move ever can be, as we might appreciate, suddenly we've got political imperative on it. Paul's made a reference to the politics of change within the Land Registry, and this really made things complicated for this particular change. Political imperative, which then meant we could not have a like-for-like office change over in London. So this is our big flagship office. This is where people come to settle big disputes. Indeed, it's where the doctors' dispute conversations, many of them took place. You'll remember that from a few years ago, the doctors' pay disputes. So it's a very sensitive, high-profile office. But no, we couldn't have a like-for-like office. Yes, we had to reduce the size of our footprint in London. No, you couldn't go to this place or that place or the other place because of the political imperatives which said we couldn't. There was third-party involvement. We have to work through the Government Property Agency. If any of you have had to do that, you'll know that brings singular challenges. And the goalposts seemed to be moving, and the opportunities for influence were limited with our choice. And then, hey, just for good measure, we had a global pandemic, bang. So everybody left Euston Tower literally within days, departed. It was the Marie Celeste. I remember very well my very last day in that building. So, next slide, thank you, Paul. So we took some practical actions to support that change. And in some ways, putting it on a slide here, it seems quite straightforward, but we had to put a huge amount of effort into these items here. And we really explicitly made an effort to focus on that people side, because we knew that this complexity, this overlay around the Places for Growth initiative was really causing challenges in the whole of the project. And it's a standalone issue in itself, but it was really overlaying on this issue. So I just want to pull out a few things on this slide, which I believe made I know made a really big difference. And they're kind of the sort of thing which, when you say, oh, yeah, okay, that's straightforward. That's the sort of thing we read about in books, but it really did make a difference. So if I pull out, we held focus groups. Okay, so that's not so, it's not the most complicated idea, is it? But we actually did do it, and we made it available to all the staff potentially affected by the move. Now, a note of caution: when you're running your focus group, of course, you have to be very careful which question you ask, because if you ask a group of colleagues what they want from their new office, funnily enough, you get quite a long wish list. We didn't quite get a home cinema set up on the wish list, but we weren't that far off with the request for the ice cream freezer, which was something we had in the current building. It's another story. And so there's some learning there about phrase your question quite carefully, put your context around it. But seriously, it made a big difference to colleagues to know that they were being asked, and we had to make sure we showed them why we'd said yes to some things and not others. The other thing there, again, it's not that difficult, but it made a big difference, was we bundled up all of the leaders who were relevant to this change, and we labelled them up as the London Office Leaders Group, which they'd never been called before. We'd got different directorates with different leadership groups, but no, everybody affected by this change, all of those leaders, that was very powerful. That made a big difference. We were able to focus on them as well as on everybody else, but give some focus to that and say, your responsibility as leaders is to do this. Your responsibility is to pass these messages on, and to give them a private space into which they could ask the questions, because they were affected by the change as well. Yeah, so that was a big thing. Change ambassadors made a big difference. I don't know about you, but when you read through the books and you read things like, change agents, change ambassadors, you think, well, that's a really good idea. And you think, oh, that's really hard. Oh, that's going to take some organising, isn't it? Oh, and you'll get that person and they'll do it because they want some time off the tools, when really you want that person who's busy and would be good at it. But we worked our way through that, and we got those people, and they were good people. We had to be clear what their roles and responsibilities were, and that changed through the project in a way that we hadn't anticipated. So we had to work through that carefully. And the other one that I'd call out on that particular slide is the engaging special groups. Okay, again, it's not the most earth-shattering idea, but again, it really helped from the sort of more transactional side of the building and its setup, by speaking to colleagues in our different diversity networks around the new building that eventually we were given. I'll be honest with you, we were given, we had really no choice over the matter. But in terms of how we set that office up, considering the challenges of that office, we were able to engage over matters around disability and access, around with our LGBTQI+ network, and that led us to the some of our gender neutral toilets, for example, and on the wider Places for Growth agenda and the impact of that agenda on our the balance of our representation of Black and minority ethnic colleagues and what that meant for them in London. You know, that engagement with diversity networks was really important. And you can see a few other things on there as well. Thanks, Paul.
Sorry, Kate.
It's all right. You'll get the memo later. And the difference it's made, those steps we took, those people-focused, classic change management steps we took. We've had the feedback. We know that people have said to us that they've felt heard, that they've seen the changes we've made in the plans, they got the clarity. We were able to get greater accountability and responsibility running through the lines that it should run through. So we're absolutely sure that made a difference, and that was good. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, this is one of my favourite things about change management. So I mentioned the APMG qualification, and that was a very intensive week with exams and everything in it in London a couple of years ago for me. And these are one of the things. This slide represents one of my key learnings out of that, one of many actually out of that week. And so if you take nothing else from today, I would implore you to note these 5 essentials of communicating change. So the one in the middle is the one that we're all familiar with, is saying the why. Why have we got this change? And of course, that's about having that strong and compelling narrative around the change, the strong and compelling narrative. And if we can't articulate the strong and compelling narrative ourselves as change and project managers, then we're really going to struggle to get that message across to anybody else. So that's a great test. Is it a strong and compelling narrative? And I think we're pretty much, we're all pretty good at saying what's going to be different. What's going to be different? So we're going to be in a different office, in a different location, and it's going to be considerably smaller. So there I've put the little image of the badgers saying, I love smarter working. So we can point to that saying, yeah, you're not going to have your own little snuggly desk with your teddy bears on anymore. It ain't going to be like that. But where I think we miss a trick, collectively, all of us, myself included, so I love this learning, is by saying what's staying the same. And the reason why that's a trick missed is as soon as you're able to identify something that's staying the same, you're giving people some comfort. Oh, it's not as bad as I thought. Oh, actually, that's okay. That's okay if I still will be a desk for me. It is okay. I will be able to come in and meet the team. No, it is okay. We have got a bit of a view because we are going to be on the 8th floor. It's not the 23rd, but hey, it's not bad. Yeah, so we say what's staying the same. And then the 2 real Johnny-come-latelys that are often missed is to honour the past. Yeah, let's not airbrush it away because we're moving forward. And I think that's a classic thing that as leaders we can be tempted to do, to say, oh, we don't want them talking about the past. We've got to get them onto the future. No, honour the past. Honour the past. We had great times. We had some wicked parties. Yeah. And we did some fantastic work there. And we loved looking out of the view. Okay, and acknowledge the losses. Acknowledge the losses. Be explicit about us. We no longer have the ice cream freezer. Yeah. On a more practical note, nor do we have first aid room. Yeah, or the view from the 23rd floor. So I say, if nothing else, hold close those essentials of communicating change. Next slide. Thank you, Paul. Now, as I say, I've mentioned the APMG qualification, and actually I only found out last week that Melanie Franklin, whose name is on this slide, is actually delivering one of your sessions today. I have no idea whether it's one you've been to already or whether it's one to come. There are loads of change professionals out there who doing fantastic stuff and providing all of us with resources, and I dip into all sorts of things. It was Melanie who trained me. I think she's absolutely brilliant, is my experience of her, and that's what her book. But I know she would say there are loads of resources there to help you. I put that quote up though, because for me, that goes to the heart of it. you're always going to get, eventually, by hook or by crook, unless something goes dreadfully wrong, your project will be delivered. Your finite activity that takes you from building A to building B will happen. The basics will happen. We don't still have, to the best of my knowledge, anybody going to the wrong building anymore. People are going to the right building. But in terms of new attitudes and behaviours and the values that support them, that's the key to achieving long-term sustained change. Our change around how we use our building, our smarter working, the Places for Growth agenda, the changing of minds and hearts. That's the challenge. That's the big prize around change management. So at the risk of being a bit reductionist about it, it's all about the people. For me, it's all about the people. So I rely on project managers to get us from A to B, with the overlay of that change management expertise to enable us to do it well. Yes, we have moved, and we're in a settled position with our Places for Growth agenda. So it's looking favourable. But those are my words of learning. And in this public forum, a big shout out and thank you to Paul Dowes, who set me on this path 4 years ago. Thank you. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Kate. I think that brings us back to you, Sally, if there are any questions.
Yeah, thank you both for that. That was really interesting. I particularly, for me personally, my takeaways really are very much your focus on simple actions. So that there's a tendency for us to think that change management is complicated and it's difficult, but actually it's often made up of us just doing simple actions and having simple conversations. So I think that was really helpful for me that you kind of brought through that simplicity. So we do have some questions. So an easy question for you to start with, just really a few people have asked if it's possible to get the end-to-end flowchart examples, please, as I can't read it on the slide. So I'm starting you with an easy one, Paul.
It might not make some sense, but I'm very happy to be able to share that. Yeah, okay. It was a bespoke process that we developed for Land Registry, but happy to share.
All right, so that was just an easy one to get you in your stride. So the next question I'd maybe call out was, what kind of communication was used to support the change strategy?
In Land Registry?
Yes, I think that would be about Land Registry because it was earlier in the process.
Yeah, so very much started with the senior leadership team. So we used to have regular senior leadership team meetings. So this was pretty much everybody that reported to a director and the next level down. And we started the conversation there. And we developed the framework iteratively with some of those people and repeating some of the lessons that Kate talked about as well, with focus groups from different areas, etc. There was lots of communication through regional presentations. So myself and the HR director, for example, would go to each of our offices and we would do presentations and take Q&A, etc. about it, intranet articles, newsletter pieces, all of the standard stuff. Again, I don't think we did anything particularly clever or novel. But yeah, just lots of communicating and lots of involvement of people. Fundamentally, it was kind of bringing together from the expertise point of view. I had a team from within the project area that were lean experts, and they were bringing in some kind of how can we do this in a non-wasteful way and make it nice and simple and signpost it well. And we had some people from the HR background that had a bit more of the soft skills and change management side. And then, as I say, just consulting lots of people and communicating every opportunity, really.
Thanks, Paul. Have we got time for one more, perhaps? So another question would be, how did you map where the colleagues are on the change curve?
The mapping of the, so that's basically through, again, in various projects, as that framework kind of demonstrates, just having focus group questionnaires, conversations, doing a little bit of a kind of almost study in parallel with as the projects were running along. And I mentioned that some of those in the overarching process, we've got kind of review points. As we were checking in on the change framework stuff, we were asking simple questions and using that data to pull that out. Just asking people to rank themselves, if you like, as to where they are against it.
Thanks, Paul. That's really helpful. And will we just try for one more question?
One for Kate.
Well, Yeah.
Probably
So
not.
yeah, one for Kate. Does a unionised environment make change harder to manage?
I think it certainly brings some singular challenges on two fronts. So we do a lot of engagement with our trade unions in Acas, and we're introducing. We've got a lot of change going through at the moment in which we are engaging with them. Harder to manage. It's certainly different to manage, and it potentially can be slower to manage. So even if it's something relatively simple, like the introduction of a new policy, we'd take time out to discuss that with the trade union side. They would take time to take the draft out to discuss with their bargaining committee or some of their members, and then they get the feedback, and then they bring it back. So you'll sense that I'm hesitating to say a blanket, oh yes, it makes it harder. I don't think that's quite accurate. I think it just makes it can make different. It more different. Yes, it's different and can be a little bit more complicated. And particularly if you've got more than one trade union with more than one constituency, and therefore with different views.
All right. Thank you very much. Now, we didn't quite answer all the questions, so we'll aim to follow those up afterwards. But it just probably remains for me to say thank you very much to our speakers, to Kate Nowitzki and Paul Dowse. So thank you very much. That was really informative.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks for having us. Hope you had a great day.